I'd like to take a moment to share with you an interesting conversation that I had with a set of new clients. It's my hope that what they have given me permission to share is a help to you, the way it was to them. He is 34 years old. She is 33 years old. They have been married for 3 years. They have a 1-year-old son. They came to me, and in fact, he came to me and brought both of them together and said, "Doc, I need you to help me with my wife because I feel like I don't have much of a wife." I said, "What do you mean?" She's sitting there on the call. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I'm doing everything that I can to be a good husband to her, but she is not reciprocating the effort that I give to her. And it's really making me question everything about not only my effort towards her, but even the quality of this marriage." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, I absolutely lead in all things. She will tell you that I'm not only a financial provider," which in his words, he said was surface. I said, "Why do you say that?" He said, "Because leadership is more than finances." I said, "Sir, you're nailing it. It's absolutely more than finances." I said, "Ma'am, do you agree with that?" She said, "Yes, sir." He continued and said, "Well, I'm leading more than just in finances, but I've done the work mentally, emotionally. I know how to control my emotions. I'm very calm with her. I'm very stable when it comes to solving problems. I don't allow things to rattle me. I'm the spiritual leader of my house. I lead our family every single week in prayer, and not just in prayer, but because they are Christians. He leads them in service and takes them to church every morning. He's the first one to get up on a daily basis when it comes to that house before he goes to work." I said, "Does she work?" He said, "No, she doesn't work. She's a stay-at-home mom. When we got married 3 years ago, we agreed that she would be a stay-at-home mom. She actually indicated that she would like to do that, but she felt a little uncomfortable." I said, "Man, why did you feel uncomfortable?" She said, "Doc, if I'm being honest with you, my husband checks all the boxes. He's been following your work. I did not know who you were. He brought you to me. And he has your book, The 5 Areas of Healing. He's been following your work. He checks all the boxes mentally, emotionally, spiritually, physically, and financially. But when he and I got together, I made it clear to him that I had some things that I needed to work on. And I believe it might be showing up in our marriage." I said, "What is it that you need to work on?" She said, "Well, if I'm being honest, I'm not used to a man who's showing up leading in all things. When we came together, we started dating. And when we seriously started dating, we talked about getting married and engaged. He met my folks, reached out to my folks, arranged a meeting to talk to them. He arranged a meeting for me to meet his parents. I did that. He's absolutely been in control, in the lead. He's done it the right way." She said, "But Doc, I'm used to men who are not on that level." I said, "In what way? Just give me one example." She said, "Well, 50-50 is one example. When he came to me and asked me, 'Hey, do you want to continue your career? Would you like to be a stay-at-home mom?' And I found out I was pregnant, I said to him, I would love to be a stay-at-home mom, but I think we should go 50-50. I said, "Really? You said that to him?" She said, "I did." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because all of the men that I've ever dated have been 50-50 men. They've always come to me and said to me that I need to carry my fair share of the weight of the relationship, of the arrangement." She said she lived with one man one time before for about a year, and she had to pay 50-50 of the rent. She had to go half on utilities, everything that was in that situation. And so I came to my husband and said to him, "Sure, I don't mind being at home, but I think we should go 50-50. I said, "Sir, is this true?" She said, "It is." He said, "Rather, it is." She came to me with that. And I said, "Sir, what did you say to her?" He said, "I thought it wasn't a good idea." I said, "Why?" He said, "Because leaders aren't 50-50 people." I said, "Let me say to both of you, 50-50 is trash. I don't care what you see on the internet, what you read in the papers. 50-50 is trash. And when you have no spiritual foundation, you have no real understanding of what it's like to have roles in a relationship. The reality is leadership from a man regarding his wife and his children is a spiritual principle." They were listening. She grabbed her journal. She started writing. He was sitting there recording notes. I said, "I want to say to both of you, the reason why I don't do a lot of talks and videos on this 50-50 nonsense is because I can't explain a spiritual principle to a generation and a culture in general who has no spiritual foundation." He got it. She said, "Doc, what do you mean?" I said, the reason why leadership in family dynamics is a spiritual foundation is because it takes God, universe, whatever people are believing in. I'm a Christian. I believe in God. But it takes belief in a higher power to recognize that it's God, husband, wife, children. If that's true, then the only way a man can lead in a marriage is what? She said, if God is leading him. I said, exactly. When you do these videos and you watch people tussle in the comments, especially women and even men, when it comes to 50-50, about leadership, and I don't need a leader, and the leadership that's necessary. I don't go back and forth with people who don't have a spiritual compass. And I said to them, I said, you will never, and I mean never, see me on a podcast arguing with other counselors, therapists, creators, whatever, over 50-50, when if you don't have a spiritual foundation, we don't even belong in the same room. He said, Doc, I couldn't agree more. She started to get a little teary-eyed. I said, ma'am, what is confusing about this is simple. Do you think that he is a real leader? She said, he is. He leads in every way. I said, perfect. I said, so if he leads in those 5 areas, what is your problem? She said, Doc, if I'm being honest, I have not been giving the effort financially that I need to give in this relationship because I don't have it to give. I'm a stay-at-home mom. I said, sir, she's staying at home as a mom. What is her financial resources like? He said, well, I give her money every week. I said, really? I said, how much money do you make? He said, I make about $120,000 a year. I said, how much money do you give her weekly? He said, about $500 a week. I said, ma'am, is that true? She said, yes, sir. I said, so you get $500 a week, 4 times a week. That's $2,000, correct? She said, I do. I said, and your job as the stay-at-home mom is to help raise you all's 1-year-old son. Is that correct? She said, it is. I said, sir, what problems are you having? He said, well, I come home from work. I have to ask you, what are we having for dinner today? Sometimes I come home, dinner is not even prepared. She fusses and complains and says she's trying to get to it, but you just hadn't felt like it that day. It was a hard day. All of these other things going on. I said, ma'am, is this true? She said, yes, sir, it is. I said, you're not going to dispute anything he's saying. She said, no, he's telling the truth. Sometimes he does come home and I'm just tired and I'm stressed out of the kid. I said, ma'am, I don't want you to think I'm minimizing parental stress. I understand that when you're a stay-at-home mom, there's a level and element of stress that's involved with this. I said, but this man is not making you pay half of the bills. Is that correct? She said, no, sir, not at all. He pays 90% of the bills. I said, sir, is that true? He said, it is. I said, he's paying 90% of the bills. He's giving you $500 a week and you're not taking care of your priorities and responsibilities at home. Is that correct? She said, yes, sir, it is. I said, ma'am, do you want to just give me one good reason why you're not doing what you're supposed to do? She said, Doc, if I'm being honest, what probably brought us here is that I had a birthday recently and he took me on a nice trip. I said, where'd y'all go? She said, Turks and Caicos. I said, really? That's nice. I said, who paid for it? She said, he did. I said, he took you to Turks and Caicos on your birthday. She said, yeah, all expenses paid. I said, great. She said, we even flew first class. I said, my kind of guy. He started laughing. I said, so he took you to Turks and Caicos and what happened? She said, well, we got there and we were having a conversation over dinner and I started getting real emotional. I said, why'd you get emotional? What did you do? She said, I started getting emotional because I started explaining to him how much I loved him and how much I appreciated him and how good of a man he is. But I just wish I could do more. I said, what do you mean? She said, I just wish I could contribute more to the marriage. I said, well, you don't work a job, right? She said, no. I said, you're getting $2,000 a month, right? She said, yeah. I said, what's going on with that money? Where is it? She said, I buy things around the house, things like that. I said, does he make you buy things around the house? She said, no, I cover the groceries and things like that. I said, do you ever have money left over? She said, I do. I said, what do you spend it on? She said, just here and there. I might shop every now and then. I said, if you want to honor your husband, why don't you save some of that money and do something nice for him? You might not be able to afford Turks and Caicos, but you could do something to show your appreciation. Is that correct? He's just sitting there looking. She said, put her head down. She said, yes, sir, it is. I said, ma'am, you're telling me you got emotional in Turks and Caicos because you felt like you wish you could do more, but you can't do more financially. Is that what you're saying? She said, that's exactly what I explained to him. I said to him, I know we agreed to be a stay-at-home mom, but I just wish I could do more. And I don't mind going back to work. He said to me, he doesn't have a problem with me going back to work. If that's what I want to do, it's not like he's making me do it. I said, so why are you emotional again? She said, because I felt like I could do more. I said, ma'am, you're telling me you feel like you can do more for him, but you have nothing to give. And this is a man that understands real leadership, because leadership means what? She said, I'm confused. I said, what does it mean to lead? She said, that means you're doing more. I said, so every man that makes an argument for 50-50 ain't no leader, because 50-50 ain't doing more. 51-49 is. I said, even if this man was doing 51-49, I would be quicker to call him a leader more than these men walking around talking about 50-50 is leadership. You're not no leader. I said, and not only is he leading financially, here's the big thing, because it ain't just about financially. He's leading in all areas. And a man cannot be a leader in some areas and not be a leader where? She said, in all. I said, he's leading in all areas. I said, even if he wasn't leading financially, let's say you were paying 70% of the bills and he was paying 30. If he's leading in the other 4 areas, I said, would you not respect him? She said, I would. I said, would you not honor him? She said, I would. I said, ma'am, there are a whole lot of women that I work with on a regular basis that would love to have the husband you're sitting next to. I said, you need to get your act together. I said, and let's just make this real plain. You're worried about money with Turks and Caicos? I said, what kind of time did y'all have? She said, we had a decent time. I said, sir, what kind of time did y'all have? He said, it was pretty cool, but she was really emotional and all over the place. I said, ma'am, you said you wanted to do more for him and you ain't got nothing to give. I said, I got an idea. She said, what? I said, why don't you present your body? He started laughing. She looked shell-shocked. She said, what do you mean? I said, ma'am, you're on the call and you got a bonnet on your head. Now, nothing wrong with bonnets if you need to wear a bonnet. I said, but ma'am, let me tell you something. I've been doing this a long time. If you didn't have the self-awareness to get on a call with a complete stranger, me, and not take your bonnet off, I can only imagine the lack of effort you showing where. She said, in my house. I said, you ain't showing no effort in your house. If you don't feel uncomfortable to the point where you can get on a call with a stranger and not take your bonnet off and not fix yourself up, I can only imagine what you look like for your husband. I said, man, present your body. This man is taking care of you and your son. He is leading in all areas. And you've admitted that and owned that. And the best you can tell me is you just wish you could do better. I said, ma'am, get yourself together mentally and emotionally. You need to do the work you need to do on yourself so that this man who is showing you effort, who ain't interested in 50-50 and who wants to be a husband, you can match what he's given. I said, because ma'am, no effort, no 50-50, eventually you ain't gonna have no husband. She started to cry. I gave her the opportunity to cry. I said, ma'am, this ain't about giving to him what he gives to you. I said, have you ever been invited to a dinner party? She said, I have. I said, have you ever been invited to a dinner party and you had to bring what everybody else was bringing? She said, I have not. I said, what was the last dinner party you was invited to? She told me about a time during Christmas. I said, what were you supposed to bring? She said, I was asked to bring the drinks. I said, perfect. I said, was somebody else asked to bring the food? She said, yeah. I said, was somebody else asked to bring the utensil? She said, yeah. I said, was somebody else asked to bring the decoration? She said, yeah. I said, everybody did what? She said, contributed. I said, when everybody does their part, we get off this 50-50 foolishness and we learn how to do the part that we're assigned to. This man has taken the lead in every area of your marriage. And if you don't have what he has to give, that's fine, but do your part. And if you ain't got nothing to give, present your body a living sacrifice. I started laughing. I said, and I don't mean holy either. You got something you can offer to this relationship. But ma'am, if you don't show the effort, and if you don't get out of this dumb 50-50 mindset, you ain't gonna have no husband either. She was very gracious, very thankful. She's doing some work with me to really work through some wounds and some trauma that she had regarding past relationships that caused her to show up in this marriage this way. And I'm pleased to say after about 3 or 4 sessions with her and 2 more sessions with them together, they're doing better. She's giving more effort in the areas that she contributes, and I think they're going to be fine. I hope this message made sense. If it did, type church in the comments with 3 R's. And then remember, you've got 2 jobs. 1, be better today than what you were yesterday. And 2, don't forget what I told you. What's up, everybody? This is Dr. Zeb. Listen, I've been dying to make this announcement for a very long time now, and I'm pleased to say that Inspire Nation has officially launched. Yes, we finally got a Facebook and YouTube community group where we're going to have exclusive content, exclusive shorts, exclusive discussion prompts, where we're going to engage with other people literally around the world who are on the same healing journey that we're on. I need you to go find these pages right now on Facebook and YouTube. Inspire Nation, follow the page, join the group, introduce yourself, and be prepared to link up with literally thousands of people around the world who are on the same healing journey, who are looking for the same resources, and who want to also be surrounded with other like-minded individuals who are growing in the same direction as you are. I'm so excited about this because it's the beginning of some great things I can't talk about right now. Listen, you got two jobs. One, be better today than what you were yesterday. And two, don't forget what I told you.